Hi, I'm Bridget Underdahl, and I'm looking forward to being able to spend time with you today to speak on educator and staff well-being. First, I'd like to pay homage to the Nisqually, Squaxin, and Coast Salish tribes. These are the lands and waterways I traverse. I cannot claim the land, but I find my home here. So I acknowledge these lands with a history, present, and future of Native sovereignty. I'm looking forward to being able to speak to you today about educator and staff well-being. A little bit about me as I spend some time speaking to you today. I have about 20 years experience as an educator, 10 years as an early childhood educator, and 10 years as a Washington State public school educator. Right now, I'm the program supervisor for Project Aware at OSPI. It's a federal mental health grant, and we're building school-based mental health systems across Washington. Some of my passions are constantly exploring how systems impact the well-being of youth and adults in our schools. And what I continue to work on is helping rebuild and grow systems of equity and care. As we get started today, I'd like to speak briefly about the term brave space that was originally proposed and coined by Brian Aro and Christy Clemens. What I like about this concept is it pinpoints the specifications around spaces of learning and growing, not being safe spaces, and that discomfort will exist. I mentioned that, and I think it's important because as we talk about educator and staff well-being today, I'm also talking about burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. So it is important to check in with yourself and what you need today as you interact with this content. It could be triggering for you. A lot of us are dealing with burnout right now. We know somebody, or most recently we've dealt with burnout. So this is a tough conversation and a tough topic. It's valuable and it's important information. I hope you interact with it today, but I also want you to take care of yourself. Some other concepts around a brave space is using gender neutral or affirming language as appropriate, making content accessible, and being reflective and not deflective. I hope we can think about all these concepts today as we take in the information. The other thing I want to mention as we dive into this information, I think quite often about this quote from Mariam Kaba, "Hope is a discipline." I think it's easy for us to think about hope as a natural feeling. If we're positive people, then we just interact with it. Maybe even if we're not hopeful, then something's wrong with us. But hope as a discipline tells us that hope takes work and constant care and thought. Just like a mindfulness practice that you do daily, making sure you get to the gym to build muscles, whatever that practice might be, diligently to grow something and build something and look forward to something. Hope as a discipline is an important concept as we talk about educator and staff wellness. And with that, I'd like to get into some data. The first piece of data I'm going to share with you is a national source. In November 2021, educators were surveyed, and 48% of those educators admitted that they had considered quitting in the last 30 days. What I think is really meaningful from this piece of data is the following quote. When superintendents from various parts of the country were asked, what % of teachers quitting would create a cataclysmic drop in your organization's ability to educate young people? The answers were low, with one answering, one teacher quitting would hurt us in a big way. I think that's important because a lot of our schools in this state and across the country can empathize with that statement. We have a lot of educators feeling like they're on the brink of quitting. Some of them are leaving the school, the profession as a whole, and our schools reflect that for a lot of cases, losing even one has a very big impact. The next piece of data is a Washington State data source. This shows graduates in education in Washington State. We're looking up to 2016, and we can see those numbers drop over time. We can see that less people are entering the profession. The next data source, again, a Washington State piece of data. We can look at the 2020-21 school year, and we can look at the percentage of educators who had emergency certificates and residency certificates. And we can see in 2021, 53% of those working in the classroom had emergency certificates. We can then look at those holding emergency certificates on the right-hand side and see how many of them stay year after year. So we can see those numbers do drop. 2018, 2019, less than half of those same individuals stay after the 2020 school year. So as we take all of that in, I would like to talk about what I get to do with a brief amount of my time in my work is Freedom Dream. And what that means is thinking about when we're reaching for the stars, what are we reaching for? What does that look like? What are the values associated with it? And what are the step-by-step ways that we could actually make it there? So as I'm freedom dreaming around this concept, I'm thinking about what do schools that practice communal care look like? How do we incorporate the adults in each school into social and emotional learning protocols? How do we use our multi-tiered systems of support frameworks to honor adult mental health and well-being? What role does self-care play alongside communal care? And how do our schools support both? What I'm hoping you'll do today is in a moment, pause the video and write down a few pieces of reflection so you can look back on it at the end of our time together today. So I'm going to read through the questions, but I do hope that you pause the video, you take a moment to either self-reflect internally or again, write down a few thoughts. In your own words, why is educator wellness important? In your view, what prevents schools from taking bolder, more integrative leaps towards educator wellness? What additional actions could you take on to support staff wellness? And what are you currently doing to take care of yourself? So take a moment and reflect. I hope you were able to reflect as we're going through this content today. I think it's really important to give a definition to staff wellness so we're all on the same page. Teacher well-being is reflected in a positive attitude towards teaching that stems from supportive relationships with colleagues and students. We know that staff wellness means it's the belief that one has the ability to teach effectively and the feeling that one's personal and professional needs and expectations are met. And very importantly, the social, emotional, and physical health of teachers is a shared responsibility and a critical component of student learning and overall community well-being. And why is it important? Why are we talking about it today? Hopefully you had a moment to reflect on that. And really, the pieces of priority are endless, but just a few of them are. Staff well-being really does correlate to the educational equity of our youth. It's an obvious connection to staff retention and mobility. And it means that we have a school community with adults who have the emotional capacity to build relationships and teach with rigor. I love this quote from Dina Simmons. No one really learns well when teachers are stressed and burned out, which is why I say stressed and burned out teaching force is an equity issue. If we believe in equity and we want our students to do well, we have to ensure our educators are doing well too. When I think about my work around building school-based mental health systems, we talk a lot about how mental health justice really is a crucial piece across all forms of justice in all of our systems. We can't have the other without mental health justice. Mental health is such a broad spectrum. I can be speaking about teacher retention as a mental health policy, an equitable school culture as a mental health policy, culturally relevant discipline practices. But again, the pinnacle piece is mental health is a part of all of them. And if we do not have that, we don't have justice in other systems. The same is true for our educators. As I think about that, as our team thinks about that with youth, the same is true for our educators. If we really want a culture of workplace wellness, we know our educators as a whole need to be well themselves. If we want them interacting with equitable and safe school climate, culturally responsive practices, again, they need to be mostly well to be able to show up emotionally and physically day to day. If we want them teaching with rigor and building relationships, we can do a lot of things at a systems level, smaller class sizes, enough support in the classroom, enough resources, and that's going to tie back to educators being well within our schools. If we want them to be present when they're in front of students and not need to, for example, take on second and third jobs, we can offer competitive salaries, again, support in the classroom. And that all ties back to our educators being well within these systems. It really is a pinnacle piece. I laugh about this cartoon quite often. I want to find a bold and innovative way to do everything exactly the same way we've done it for 25 years. So a lot of our concepts around wellness are going to be new concepts. This is something we're learning from all the time. And we also don't take a ton of time as a society to think about this, to learn about this. So we are going to be moving forward in new ways. And as we move forward in new ways, we're probably going to human is to error. We're not always going to get it right. So I do want to pinpoint some common pitfalls when workplaces start interacting with well-being work, some of the things that they're going to want to avoid. It's important to decolonize wellness and really decolonize, decapitalize, decouple from paid experiences. What do I mean when I say that? What I'm talking about is if we interact with, we add on yoga practices as a wellness protocol in our schools. We really want to interact with the historical and the modern day context of yoga outside of a Western viewpoint. And why are we incorporating that into our school and get some context? When we talk about care, we also want to make sure that these aren't just paid for experiences, that these are experiences that everybody can take part in, and that we're creating inclusive programs, and we've reflected on bias. So including anti-fat bias, we're not just focused on weight loss, pedometers, interactions like that. We thought about neurodivergent, BIPOC individuals, so that every individual, and especially those who are typically othered in these spaces, can take part in wellness protocols. Sometimes a workplace might look at data around vacation and sick leave and see that individuals are not using them to the extent that they could, and that might be the viewpoint that they are doing well. What I like to reiterate is when we look at data, what is it really telling us? How do we interpret data? So we want quantitative and qualitative. We might want to ask our staff, why aren't you taking sick leave or vacation time? And we would probably get answers like, we don't have a sub to come into the classroom. There's guilt and shame around asking a peer to come in again to their classroom, or they're not getting the supports they need, or they're overwhelmed to write the sub plans, whatever it might be. But we need to have spaces around how do we reflect and think about data so that it's telling us the truth that it's holding. Another really important thing to think about is a focus on self-care can be weaponized when other systems level supports are desperately needed. Again, what do I mean by that? Self-care is obviously vital and important. And if we don't acknowledge communal and group-wide care, as well as systems level care, we're really starting to weaponize self-care. We're telling individuals, if you're not well, it's all on you and it's all your fault, rather than acknowledging what a workplace can do to support educators and staff. So educators really do need more than self-care. I love this quote by Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. We think about that in a continuum of care. Again, self-care is important. Individuals need to interact with that, and it needs to be destigmatized, to talk about in the workplace and normalized. And we need group and communal care We need system-wide support so that self-care really has the benefits that we want it to. In our interactions with building school-based mental health systems, we've received all kinds of data. And one of the pieces is we've talked to staff members at the schools that we're building these grants. And we've heard a lot about burnout and staff wellness. They've told us that it's really bad. They've told us they need a moment, they need support. They need things taken off of their plates, especially if additional trainings are being added to those schedules. Schools really need to think about mental health. And in the work that I get to do, and schools are very familiar with this model, multi-tiered systems of support. We can think about it through mental health. We can think about it through behavior. We can think about it through our educational structures. This is a model through mental health, mental and behavioral health. We have a bottom tier in which we're normalizing and destigmatizing the concepts around mental health as a community. And then again, we should be very familiar with our MTSS structure, our tier 1 through 3. Tier 1 being, what can we do for all students? What might some students need? And what do a few students need? Building up these services around mental health. Again, briefly, I just wanted to show you another example of an MTSS triangle, because we can do the same thing for educators. This was built from Mikey and Associates. They're going to be a part of our March 9th webinar to speak on this. And I think it's a great example around what educator and staff well-being can look like in a systems level. Again, we have those foundational policies and practices that normalize the sense of care. And then based on data, we think about, what do all the adults in our system need? What would they benefit from? Maybe social and emotional learning, mental health literacy, etc. What do some adults need based on the data? Maybe they need peer-led support groups, targeted individual mental health treatment. And then what do a few of those adults need? This might be individual group therapy. So we can bring our educators into the MTSS system and care for them as well. And a part of that is normalizing this. We really prioritize care when we normalize it. And I give this example of Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, who took time off from the Tokyo Olympics and their Grand Slam events, respectively. And they spoke quite frankly that those reasons were related to mental health. These types of stories in the media help normalize this type of care, so that hopefully as more individuals do this, the stories aren't centered around them being brave that they did that, but that this is a normal part of being well. We would do the same thing to recover from a physical injury, and we can normalize it around mental health as well. So let's normalize prioritizing mental health over performance and live in a world where your job comes second to your well-being. Let's all have teammates, peers, colleagues that can step in and cover us when we're struggling. And we're seeing similar things happen across this state as well, and across the country. Our Secretary of Education speaking about mental health and the necessities, emergency proclamations from the governor, the US Surgeon General, et cetera, around a youth mental health crisis. And again, the more this is spoken of across the media, the more policy we have, the more it becomes normalized. We can do the same thing in our schools. So you can think about for a moment, how do we normalize well-being in schools? What does that look like? It might be mental health literacy training, mindfulness practices attached to meetings, emotional check-ins at some of those meetings rather than just diving in. Normalizing the need to take time off and validate that. The list can go on, but you can think about normalizing well-being in schools as that starts to appear across the country, in the media, through policy. What does that look like in our schools, in your school? And as you think about this, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like I don't have the training to interact with these concepts. I'm not a therapist. Not everyone is a therapist, but everybody can be therapeutic. Everybody can be supportive of one another in the systems of care if we build those systems correctly and with everyone in mind. Again, I like this cartoon. Good work, but I think you just need a little more detail right there for the then a miracle occurs. And I share this because I've talked a lot about things to avoid, some background around the concept, but what's the do? What can you do for educator and staff well-being? So let me speak to some of that. The first thing we can think about is internal data. Obviously, that's important across our schools in all kinds of different measures. It's important here as well. So it's important to ask our teachers how they're doing, what supports they need, and get that feedback. We really want to strive to understand their experience rather than just guess how they're doing. And we want to promote teacher well-being measures through the progress we're making over time. And as we have that progress, we can better communicate it out through the data that we're collecting. What I've definitely received as feedback, especially during the pandemic, back from individuals is I can't add another full survey. Maybe that's because of an MOU. Maybe that's because staff are just not likely to get those questions back there. They have a lot on their plates. So here's a few ideas to get started or continue with data if that's your case. You could look at the workload toolkit or professional quality of life questions and just pull a few of the, rather than doing the entire surveys, you pull a couple of those questions off and add it to an already existing school-based survey that happens at the beginning, the end of the year, one that's already in an MOU or a contract, one that's most likely to get feedback from educators. One-on-one interviews are another really great place to do this. And you could capture some thinking from focus groups or teams. The reason we collect data is because it's not always obvious. It's not always obvious with our youth around mental and behavioral health, and it's definitely not always obvious with our staff. So we have externalizers that may become obvious to us, those type of behaviors that show us that there is quite a need around mental or behavioral health. But in our staff as well, we have a lot of internalizers. It won't be as obvious the care that they need. They won't talk about it. They won't share it, maybe face to face. But if you start to collect data, if you start to normalize it, you're gonna see those pieces of information of individuals who do need that care and what that looks like. So we can support teacher well-being through, as I've spoken about, teacher voice. We can start to think about and supply opportunities for teachers to participate in decision-making and support their own professional growth around well-being. With that data, we can think about really strong tier 1 supports. What do all staff need to be well here? And what educators talk about a lot in those strong tier 1 supports is workload, which is why I think the workload toolkit survey questions can be great to pull from, because so many educators speak to equitable is not always equal, or it's not always giving equal tasks to all colleagues. Educators definitely need things taken off of their plates, but there needs to be conversations. What does that look like when all of the work is so needed? So how do we support educators with their workload and normalize time off as needed, setting boundaries, and making sure that they can be successful? Other ways to get started, thinking about our school culture. We can create school environments that promote feelings of belonging, respect, and value. Obviously, a positive school environment and climate is going to be important for the capacity of wellness. We can be really intentional about professional development. Make sure we're building in breaks and reflection time. Share the prior sense making on why this isn't just one more thing or why it is important. And making sure that we do balance the workload of educators. If we're adding additional things, what can we take off? Why, when, how? Again, we can normalize, normalize, normalize. Mental health is health, just like physical health is health. So we can think about staff referrals for mental health and other services. We can acknowledge and support secondary trauma and have school-wide supports. Again, we can normalize the practice of care and wellness in schools, and that's an everyday thing. So staff walks, breathing activities, mindfulness minutes, cute animal videos, but normalizing that, speaking to mental health and well-being when we're doing so. We can act change by implementing policy. You can think about what systems level work you leverage and retain by changing or updating policy. And it's important to keep in mind with any plan we make, we need to align every statement of value and every goal or aspiration with specific actions and outcomes. What steps are you taking to eliminate the burdens many educators face, and how are you supporting their ability to be successful in the classroom? So again, if you have a particular statement, especially one around educator well-being, it needs to be connected to what actions are taking place and communicating those actions over time. So as we speak about these levels of care, self-care is also important. And like I said before, we really want to think about it in a frame of mind where it's decapitalized, where it's decoupled from any kind of paid experiences. We are very much advertised to, and our society speaks a great deal around things we can buy associated with self-care. That's really not the definition of self-care. So what is it? I'll give you a few examples, and these can be spoken about with staff. These are things that you can keep in mind yourself. One piece of self-care is to reflect on connection. Do you need to reconnect or disconnect today? How can you better nurture your connections to your sense of self and the world around you? You can think about healing. Have you acknowledged your own need to heal from recent events? How could you start to make time for emotional healing? You can take time to listen, and that means to your body and your mind, and always be connecting with it. What are they communicating? What do you really need? How can you respond to those needs? Giving yourself space. How do you make space for yourself? How do you create space for your feelings and your needs? And rest. Rest is huge, and rest is radical. When was the last time you let yourself rest? When did you last take a real break? And how can you make and prioritize time for this? With that in mind, I want to share a comical video as an interlude right now.
Pre-K pause. I know what you're all thinking. Mr. Williams, it's 11 o'clock on a Monday. What are you doing at home? Let me tell you, I took a day off, a planned day off. I don't have any doctor's appointments. I'm not sick. I don't have any errands to run. I took a personal day. Why did I take a personal day? Because I needed one. A lot of the times as educators, we talk about not taking days off like it's a badge to wear. We need to normalize taking days off when we need them. It's self-care, and practicing good self-care helps lower our burnout rate. Conserve your energy when you need it. Be honest with your physical and mental self, and take that day off, girl. A perfect attendance award is not worth your mental well-being.
And really similar, here's a quote from Dwayne Reed, our keynote speaker on March 9th, which you can watch in person March 9th at 10 a.m. or view a recording afterwards. As a school administrator, I would much rather have you opt for 2 or 3 days than lose you to burnout. We need you, but we will make it work while you're away. Please take your personal days. Even just this concept of taking personal days is a really interesting one, because there is the capacity of self-care, setting a boundary, really reflecting on what care looks like for you, and making sure you utilize those systems of care. And then the systems of care need to be there to support you. So you can decide to take a day off, but you need subs ready to support you, or peers ready to support you without guilt or shame. So we have all levels of care. We can think about self-care, group care, and systems-wide care, even in this conversation around taking a day off for educators. But again, don't get me wrong, self-care alone can't heal you, and it can't heal our communities. Communal care is important. So we can continue to think about, how do we make our schools vehicles for communal care? There are a variety of resources for you this month of March, including the Adult Wellness Calming Room created by Highline School District. This is great for resources, those mindfulness videos, cute animal videos, some mental health resources. It's a great grab and go spot for just quick resources when you're starting to normalize and interacting with wellness. A variety of articles that you can read and reflect on individually as well as with teams to continue this discussion. I mentioned the workload toolkit and the professional quality of life measures. These are two great surveys that you can interact with as a whole, or again, just pull a couple questions off of, like I mentioned previously. And then how to build your own school wellness committee toolkit. The next step is thinking about, as you begin or continue to grow educator well-being, where will this work be housed? Who is responsible? What individuals can come to the table to prioritize it? So that committee toolkit helps you with that. So I'd like you to take out what you wrote at the beginning of our time. Now that you've heard everything, and you can write some additional thoughts or have some additional reflections. Does your school or district have multiple small-scale educator wellness initiatives? Are they making a difference? What language can you now use when you advocate for educator and staff wellness? Within your context, given your sphere of influence, how far out of baby steps could you stretch? Then, how can you make a commitment to stretch at least that far? What ideas do you have moving forward? What have you learned today that you can take into tomorrow? I hope you take a minute, again, to pause, reflect, and write down a few thoughts. And back to the original quote that I spoke of earlier, hope is a discipline. This is an overwhelming topic. It is a generational issue. It will continue in value and difficulty far after I even continue to work in this area. And it is value, and I have hope that it will continue to grow and interact and support educators and staff so that they can be successful in their classrooms. Along with this topic, I hope you join us March 9th at 10 a.m. We'll be joined by Dwayne Reed, myself, Michelle Mikey, Megan Osborne, Sophie DeHaan. We're going to talk about all concepts of staff wellness, from self-care, group and communal care, and systems-wide care, and what that looks like in our school. We'll delve into this topic even more. You can interact with me and email me with any questions. You can look at the Project Aware webpage to learn more about that work, and you can interact with OSPI as a whole and reach out to us. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm glad that I was able to go through some concepts around educator and staff wellness. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Nelson Mandela. May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears. So my wish for you and my wish for this work is the acknowledgement that it won't always be perfect and it won't always be linear, but that your hopes will guide you to do better and better over time and include more and more people in wellness and make our schools even more equitable and wonderful spaces for our educators and our youth as a whole, because we're focused on wellness as the core of need and responsibility in those spaces. Again, thanks so much for your time today.